Well, hello, everyone. My name is Tammy Wilson. I'm a director at the Sacramento County Office of Education, and I'm excited to welcome you to this webinar focused on implementing Education Code 53008, Screening for Risk of Reading Difficulties. This webinar is hosted by the Sacramento County Reads Initiative in partnership with Glean Education. The Sacramento County Office of Education is committed to improving reading and literacy outcomes, and we're partnering in this webinar as part of our Sacramento County Reads Initiative, which is focused on leveraging the contributions of educators, community leaders, and organizations and families to create coherent systems that support improved literacy outcomes. For more information about our initiative, please feel free to visit our website. Today, we're welcoming close to 900 educators and colleagues from across the state and the country to this third session in our webinar series. And we're really excited to hear from Dr. Sarah Brown about implementation of universal screening with specific information about what do we do now that we've screened. So I'm going to hand off to my friend and colleague, Jessica Hammond, our partner from Glean Education.
Thank you, Tammy. We're excited to partner with SCOE and the Sacramento County Reads Initiative for this California Screening webinar event. For those of you who are not yet familiar with us, Glean Education partners with schools, districts, and states to deliver training, coaching, and school leader consulting. Our work aims to build educator knowledge of dyslexia and evidence-based literacy practices to improve student literacy outcomes. These webinars allow us to offer information on California's new reading difficulties risk screener requirements, and our purpose is to deliver support to districts to better understand them and help them make informed choices as they move forward in this work. This is the third in a series of webinars on California's reading difficulties risk screening. Tonight we'll be delving into the topic of We've Screened, Now What? With Dr. Sarah Brown. After the presentation, we'll be providing a short Q&A session, and we'll be recording this session and posting the recording on Glean Education's webinar website. Dr. Sarah Brown is the president of System Impact Consulting and co-author of the books Effective Universal Instruction and MTSS for Reading Improvement, a leader's toolkit for school-wide success. She served in roles including the bureau chief leading special education and MTSS implementation in Iowa, special education director, professional learning administrator, and school psychologist. She's also led customer education and MTSS with K-12 education technology companies. She's interested in the implementation of MTSS and improving systems to support high-achieving students for each learner. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Brown.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate both Glean and SCOE, you and Tammy inviting me here today. And I'm really excited to dig into how to take action with the screening data that you'll have next year as part of this code in California. And as we get started, I would like to know in the chat, so I'll be able to see your chat. You won't see from the other participants, but know that we will see it on our end. I'm interested to know if screening will be new to your school, or if in this coming year, or if you've been screening and you have a tool that you've been using to screen students. So I'm just gonna kind of see. So far, it looks about half and half to me. There's a lot of answers coming in. But yeah, then some saying that they're screening already, and so it's about half and half. Thank you so much. There are a lot of schools in California who are already screening, and so you're probably considering how do these new data work with my current screening practices, and then it might also be that screening is brand new to your school. And so today we're going to really talk about what to do. And we're going to start with this idea of interpreting screening results. And so how to understand the screening data that you're getting, what are they telling you? To do a good job of that, I'd like to start by really placing screening in this idea of the different types of assessment that you likely have. We oftentimes say in schools that we have a lot of data. We might have too much testing or a lot of data. You also hear the concept of we're data rich and information poor. So what does this all really mean, right? So screening is one type of data that your teachers might use, that you as leaders might use. And as we dig into interpreting those data, let's first kind of think about how screening compares to the other types of assessment that we have in schools. So screening assessments help us answer a couple questions, one of which is which students and which grade levels are at risk in reading. And so good screening tools have really strong technical adequacy, and the bigger, better deal about them is that they do a really good job of predicting later outcomes. And that lets schools be able to really answer that question, who is at risk, and do we have grade levels where we have a lot of risk? Sometimes screening tools are curriculum-based in nature, so you might use something called CBMs as screening tools. Some schools use measures that are computer adaptive for screening tools, and then sometimes schools will use measures that measure very specific skills that are predictive of overall reading outcomes. So there are different types of screening assessments that you might see, and what you want to watch out for if you're thinking about, is what we have a screening tool? Is it not? Making sure that you that as we're thinking about screening, we're really thinking about identifying which students are at risk. So we want to make sure that we're using assessments that do a really good job of that, and that help us really inform our instruction. So that's screening. We're going to spend most of today talking about screening, but I do want to place it a little bit in comparison to the other types of assessment that you might have. So another type of assessment that many schools use are what we call progress monitoring assessments. These help us, and they're actually called out in this California code because they're a really evidence-based way to identify if our instruction and intervention are successfully accelerating learning for students who are at risk in reading. So really strong progress monitoring tools are really efficient to administer so that I can use them with students who are at risk of reading, but not lose a lot of instructional time. And they have to be sensitive to small changes in skills so that I can use them often, which is the big idea with progress monitoring. Then I can use those data to see how effective are our programs. Do I need to intensify something? Many of those are CBM in nature, are curriculum-based in nature. So in reading, the primary one that's used in elementary grades or something like an oral passage reading measure, there's different progress monitoring tools that schools use in order to look at the effectiveness of their interventions. And then what you want to watch out for is that you make sure that you choose a tool that you can use quite often if you are going to progress monitor so that you can use those data over time. And then a third type of assessment that we see really helpful in schools and that schools are using every single day are those daily formative assessments, things that help us know, what do I teach right now? So those are really assessments that can be more informal in nature, but they inform our immediate instruction. So things where I'm having all students write on whiteboards and showing me so that I can see how they're doing with a specific concept that we're teaching, or using some sort of like thumbs up and thumbs down type of work. So things that I can use to get class-wide information really quickly to help me be able to know what to teach next. And then they oftentimes provide, all the teachers are getting definitely lots of feedback from all students when they're using these daily formative assessments. And many times we're also giving that feedback back to students about their learning so that they know where they're at and what they might need to learn next. And so daily formative is another type of assessment that schools are using every day. Those are typically assessments where we're using with all students, so not just some students. And then we often don't grade those either and report those out. And then finally, diagnostic assessment. So that helps us identify specifically what skills should be targeted. This is also called out in the rule as another potential type of assessment that you might use. And the things you want to look for with good diagnostic assessments are that they measure very specific skill deficits and measure them multiple times so that we're not just giving a student maybe one try at a specific skill, but several tries so that we can be really confident when we identify that they need to learn a very specific skill. So those are helpful for that. And sometimes they have more formal technical adequacy behind them, and sometimes they're more informal skill surveys or inventories, like phonics skill surveys or phonemic awareness skill surveys. And so as we think about now where screening falls in this whole piece, screening I want you to think about screening assessments like a well-child checkup. They tell us if students are on track with their reading skills and if they're growing enough to remain on track. So even if our children are healthy, we still go to a well-child checkup, and they use lots of different measures to screen and to identify, is a student on track? Is a child on track with their growth and development? And are they growing at a rate that keeps them on track? And that's the same thing that we're doing when we're using universal screening in our schools. So let's dig into then how to use those data and to think about how to use those data when we have them. So the first thing we're going to do is dig into tier 1 as we look at those screening data. And that's the instruction and curriculum that all students receive. So it's the core reading instruction that all students in grade, maybe kindergarten or your second grade, that they receive. So we're going to start there, and we're going to start there because it's the way that we have the biggest impact on student learning overall is by focusing on tier 1, because that's where the majority of our time is in teaching reading, is in that core instruction that everybody gets. So here's what as we think about the code, here's what's in your California code. And I actually love this. It's a bit different from some other states that I get to work in, but I actually love the way that the California code is worded. So for students who are at risk in reading, schools shall provide supports and services, and then they have a list of what some of those might be. So it might be that students need evidence-based literacy instruction focused on the student's specific needs. We hope that we're doing that for all students all the time, right? When we think about students who are at risk in reading, we absolutely want to make sure that they're provided with evidence-based literacy instruction. It might include progress monitoring. That's that type of assessment that I alluded to, that I explained earlier. We're measuring for students who are at risk and who are reading some extra support and intervention, regular assessment, in order to make sure that instruction and intervention is having the required the level of effect that we're really looking for. Early intervention in the general education and program. And so one of the greatest benefits of screening, which we'll also talk about, is that we can use that then to impact student outcomes. And so having screening is a really great way to be able to provide early intervention, because we have really technically valid data that are predicting later reading outcomes early, and we can shore up and close really small gaps in learning before they become bigger achievement gaps. And so that early intervention is a piece, one-on-one or small group tutoring, and then further evaluation or diagnostic assessment when that's needed for us to know specifically what specific skill needs students have. So we can think about that at an individual student level, but we can also think about these things at your tier 1 level, because here's the reality in many schools, and your school might be the same. And when we look at a classroom, some classrooms have half of their students who are at risk. And so if there's a teacher in your school who has half of the students in their classroom that are identified as being at risk in reading by these screening measures, expecting that a teacher can do all of these things, or even some of these, like over half of these things for every one of these students, can be really, really overwhelming. And what can happen is that the quality of the interventions becomes less. Even if we see that we have a third of students in classrooms, this would be a lot of students for teachers to meet their very specific skill needs individually, if I'm focusing individually. And here's what happens when we have a lot of students who have these needs, and individual teachers are expected to meet all of their needs by thinking individually about each student. Their interventions become very overburdened. When I do the grocery shopping for my family, and as I bring in the groceries every single time, I try to carry all of the groceries in at once. I never want to make a second trip to the car, even though I have a garage. And more than once I drop bags. I've lost a gallon of milk on the garage floor before. Like these are things, right? I'm carrying too much. I'm trying to do too much. And when we overload our intervention systems, our interventions get stretched really thinly too, and they become really overwhelmed. Everything becomes a little bit more hard. So it becomes harder to schedule those interventions. Collecting frequent progress monitoring data can also become really hard. Our teachers get overwhelmed, and then we also don't see the results that we expect. And everybody in the system, our teachers and our families and everyone can become a little bit more, frustrated. And so because of this, when we have too many students who need intervention, if you find as you do screening that you have a lot of students who need intervention and your systems can't support that, then we want to look to our tier 1 system and what we're doing with all students. And there are a couple ways we can think about that. The first thing we can think about is, how is our tier 1 instruction meeting the needs of all of our students? That evidence-based literacy instruction, meeting the needs of the students in our buildings and in our classrooms today. So what we know from the simple view of reading is that in order to achieve that goal of reading comprehension, we need to make sure that students have word recognition skills and language comprehension skills. So for example, I may have some curricular materials. I'm really sure, like we may have done a lot of learning and have some materials that are really strong in the word recognition component and are providing evidence-based practices. And I might have, we know that language comprehension skills, they're developing from birth. And so as students are listening to language, we're gaining those language comprehension skills. So when students come into kindergarten, they have they have vocabulary skills, they have they have that receptive comprehension skills. So they have a lot of skills already. And we might have students in your school who are learning to speak English, who are multilingual learners who are learning English. And so while they have a really rich language comprehension skills in a language, it might not always be in English. And so as we're supporting the needs of those students, we need to make sure that we don't rely solely on intervention systems to do that. So I might be looking to my tier 1 to help support those students. And here's a way I might do that. So when we think about those those language skills for all students, I might take a lesson that we have and identify and say, okay, here is a lesson, a phonics lesson. Here's our scope, and here's our the protocol that we use, the specific steps that we teach these skills on. And I'm going to model. I do this with the students. This is what it is for all of our classrooms. I might add on, if I have a lot of multilingual learners who are learning English, I might add on some those language comprehension skills onto that routine that we use in all of our classrooms, so that now I've leveled the playing field. I've created the tier 1 instruction that is going to support all students. And so as we think about what that looks like, I can create and make sure that my tier 1 is meeting the needs of all of my students. The other thing that I can do, if we have from that screening assessment, if we have identified a lot of students who have intervention needs and we can't provide individual interventions to each of these students, is to look also to a tier 1 intervention. So I can look and see, for the majority of our students, where do we see needs and how can we provide an intervention to all students that's going to meet those needs. This is often called, in the research, it's called class-wide intervention. But the idea here is that we're providing additional instruction, teacher-led instruction, in specific skills that students already should have learned that they haven't mastered yet. And we're delivering that to all students. So it might be some extra time in a reading block, so we extend the reading block. It might be that we replace individual practice time where students are working more individually with this evidence-based routine or practice. And it gives students additional instruction. And the idea is that we're providing an intervention to everybody. And so for many of our students who turn up at risk on these reading screening measures, we can make sure that we're meeting their needs. We're doing that, though, through a tier 1 class-wide intervention. The California law doesn't require, it requires that you provide an intervention, or that you provide supports and services that are tied to the student's specific needs. But it doesn't require that those are tier 2, tier 3 interventions. So additional kind of pull-out interventions or in that nature. So a tier 1 intervention, if you have a lot of students who are coming up at risk, a tier 1 intervention that's highly focused on very specific skills that all teachers are using at a grade level may meet the needs for some of your students as well. And so as you think about, if you plan to use evidence-based tier 1 intervention, you'll want to think about some specific strategies. So pieces from the evidence base from the literature on tier 1 intervention, or class-wide intervention is what it's often called in the literature, are that we provide more guided practice with corrective feedback. So students are getting additional practice and skills that they should have learned, and that they're getting corrective feedback. So it might look like in a reading class, maybe we're having students do some partner reading with some decodables that we are cover some skills that we've already taught. And we're getting students extra practice in reading, but they're doing it in partner so that they automatically are getting that corrective, the feedback if they need it. Having a really high dosage of opportunities for students to participate. So it's not a lot of teacher talking like is happening right now in this session, but also is a lot of students actually doing the particular work. And so students are participating very highly in that intervention. And then the materials and skills that students are accurate with but haven't yet mastered, so things that they need more practice with in order to be an on-track reader. And then as much as we can, we want to reinforce motivation and engagement. So reinforcing students working really hard during this time, making sure that students are motivated to really get the most out of this extra instructional time. So that's what we know from the evidence base. So if you are thinking about doing a tier 1 intervention as part of meeting the needs of students who are at risk on your reading screening measures, those are the components that you'll want to make sure you have in a plan that you look at. And class-wide intervention has research behind it. I have a year-long service where I work with schools through an MTSS Data Academy. And these are data from a specific school that I've worked with, and they have a really strong instructional coach at one of their elementary schools. And then this elementary school, they have 86% free and reduced students who receive free and reduced programs. 73% of their students are minority status. And they implemented tier 1 intervention was their focus for improvement in reading across a school year. And in 2nd grade, in 1 year, from their fall, they do universal screening more often than once a year. But in their fall universal screening, they had 29% of 2nd graders were on track. And at the end of the year in their spring universal screening, 61% of 2nd graders were on track. They were doing some tier 2, tier 3, some interventions for specific student needs, but the majority of their work, their focus for what they worked with their teachers on, professional learning all year, was around that tier 1 intervention. How can we provide extra intervention to all students across 2nd grade? And they saw really great growth from that. So we know that can be a good way to increase outcomes. And when we do that, though, what we see as effective is that we want to ensure that all teachers have a common format that they can document. If you're using it as part of your use and your response to the screening data as part of your California screening for risk in reading, you'll want to make sure that you have a common form to document that, and that teachers are confident in knowing what they're going to do as part of that tier 1 intervention. And so having a plan that identifies specifically what they're going to do to intervene and provide that intervention to all students, the specific skills that it's aligned to, so that you know, and this is where the match is for our students, how often you're going to use that, and then thinking about how we're going to progress monitor. So we've provided for you in that Padlet. You have a link to a sample plan that you can use to document that tier 1 extra intervention that you might be providing. So that's one way that you might respond and identify, what's next. Now we have these data. How are we going to respond? That tier 1 intervention might be one way to respond. Now we're going to look at the other side. So let's look at how we can use data to inform specific interventions that you might provide. That code actually requires evidence-based literacy instruction that's focused on the pupil's specific needs. So that comes directly from the code. We want to provide instruction and intervention that's aligned to student needs. And when you do that, we know that it's likely in the code. I didn't obviously write the code, but it's likely in the code because we know that through research that matching intervention to specific skill needs is shown through research to lead to greater student growth. So if I identify that a student has a need in the area of phonics and I implement a phonics intervention, we tend to see more growth than if I see that a student has a need in phonics and I implement a fluency intervention. That's less likely. We might see some growth, but we're less likely to see as much growth than if we really match that intervention. So I want to help you think about what are some ways that schools look at and have some screening data to match to their specific interventions. And one of the things that is helpful is knowing that some of your screening data that you may have, depending on the screening tools that you use, may actually help to match to intervention. So when we think about the specific skill needs the students may have, they may have needs in the area of phonemic awareness. So if students have skill deficits in phonemic awareness, and you need to match intervention to that phonemic awareness, and you want to match to that phonemic awareness need, you may already have some screening data that align with that, or you may have tools locally, especially if you're using other screening measures also in your school, and you have measures like this, you may be able to use those as a way to look to see after we have these this overall data, and I see that we have screening risk, we have risk for a student, then I might drill down and collect some other data to identify if a student has a phonemic awareness skill need. So I could do that through a phoneme segmentation fluency measure or an onset sound fluency measure. Those are some common ones that schools use that measure phonemic awareness very specifically. And so I might look to see, okay, if we already have these screening data, and one of the measures is phoneme segmentation fluency or onset sound fluency. If the student shows up as at risk on that subtest of the screener, then I would have a good idea that phonemic awareness might be a skill deficit that we need to target in order to accelerate learning. Similarly, I can look at the area of phonics, and you might have a screening tool or access to a screening tool that you could use for those students who show up as at risk on your California risk screening measure in phonics skills. So letter naming fluency in kindergarten, especially the beginning of kindergarten, letter sound fluency, nonsense word fluency, word reading fluency, and oral passage reading or oral reading fluency are all measures that align very closely with phonics skills. And so you can look to see if students are at risk on any of these measures. You can either dig in more or start to look to find specific phonics deficits, or at least have a clue in the beginning that we really need to hone in for that intervention time on phonics skills, knowing that that by targeting skills more directly, we can have a greater impact on student growth during intervention. And then finally, language skills. So sentence repetition is in some of your measures. And so you can use that to identify, okay, do we have a language deficit that we might want to hone in and target our intervention skills specifically on language skills. So this is some way. So one of the things that you want to try to do is when you identify a group of students who are at risk on that on your screening measure, trying to really hone in on the specific skills that they need to focus on during intervention, because we know interventions will be more effective if we are targeting those specific skill gaps. So now let's talk about more generally, as you're thinking about now, acting on these data. We have the data, so what? I've identified maybe some tier 1 interventions we might do. We have now some, we're thinking about providing some interventions to specific students. What do we know are most effective interventions? Because the goal of intervention is to accelerate student progress. So we're going to talk about next some qualities of intensive literacy instruction and intervention that are evidence-based. So what about interventions gives us the highest yield and the highest student growth? Because I know that your teachers, none of us are trying to provide extra instruction that isn't resulting in really great student growth. So here's what we know from the research around intensive literacy intervention and instruction. So the first is that, that we're providing intervention and instruction that is using a learning progression. So that means that we have a scope and sequence to the skills that we're teaching. So as we think about when we provide literacy intervention, we want to make sure that we're not just kind of thinking about every day, right? or every week what skill we might teach next, but that we have a progression that we're going through, that we're using an evidence-based scope and sequence of our reading skills. The next is that we're using an evidence-based intervention program as the foundation of effective intervention. So when we think about students who are at risk in reading, effective programs are really helpful. Our programs, when we think about intervention programs, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them more, but having a program is really helpful because they've done a lot of the hard work that is really hard to develop a program yourself. And so for students who are already behind and we need to accelerate their learning, having a program can be really helpful. And then that we're using ongoing database decision-making for providing and intensifying interventions. So we're using our data over time, whether that's within the program that we have or with progress monitoring, to decide when we need to intensify that intervention or make a change to that intervention. We don't want to go a whole semester or a whole year in the same intervention and then find out that a student isn't making enough progress. And then that we're willing to make alterations to increase the intensity of the intervention. So if we see that a student isn't making enough progress, what are we doing in order to improve and intensify the success of that intervention? And finally, that we have systems that can support students with severe and persistent literacy needs. So as we start to see that a student, we're providing extra instruction, maybe in the classroom, the teacher is providing extra intervention, and then maybe the student is getting access after a while to an interventionist who might also be providing more intensive intervention. If we see that a student still has a more severe and persistent literacy need, that we're able to provide more support to that student, more intensive support to make sure that they were able to accelerate their learning. Those are the things that we see are really effective and based in the research around what makes literacy intervention successful. And I'm going to show you next a graphic that can kind of show you what many times what I hear next is, okay, but what does it look like? Like, how should it be structured in a school, Sarah? So many schools are implementing a multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS, where over time they have interventions that are more supplemental in nature as part of tier 2, or more intensive in nature and individualized in nature as part of tier 3. And so these types of programs have more specific outlines of, many schools will outline, here's what this looks like in practice. And much of that is evidence-based. Some of it is based on what we know through some research and we get an idea of through research. And so things like the assessments that we're using. So in addition to screening data, which is always included in all systems, and frankly, I've never seen a school system that's dramatically improved reading outcomes school-wide that isn't using screening. So I'm excited that you're all going to be using screening next year, because it's a really critical part to improving outcomes for all students. But we also sometimes might need regular progress monitoring data or some specific diagnostic data, like those phonics surveys or some of those specific screening tools that you might be able to use to get a very good first target. And I might need more information if needed sometimes to really target that specific intervention. And then when we think about dosage, this is the part that schools often ask about most. So how much intervention should I be providing? When we think about intervention dosage, when we think about students who need supplemental intervention, oftentimes we want to try to get through 3 to 5 lessons per week. And usually from some of the research and guidance that we have from research, it's about 20 to 40 minutes per session. So when we think about what students who might need to have successful interventions that close literacy gaps, those pieces are often helpful. And then in small group nature, and so not in kind of a whole class system, and that we're using explicit systematic instruction that's targeted to their needs. The main thing that changes when we look at tier 3 is the intensity of that instruction. So then we're looking typically at more daily sessions of 30 minutes or more in order to really be able to accelerate learning and have students catch up. So, as you're thinking about structuring intervention systems to support students who have needs, I hope that this provides you with a little bit of support as you're thinking about what that might look like in your schools. And then I want to go back to this intervention program piece for just a minute. I often get asked questions about from schools about, do we need to use a specific intervention set of materials, or can teachers decide what to teach. I mean, you can do either, and I would say let your data guide you as to what's going to be successful with your students. So follow your data. If you are using interventions that teachers are developing and you're seeing really great student growth, students are catching up and they are becoming, they're catching up after they're identified as being at-risk readers, then absolutely continue what you're doing. Many schools will adopt intervention programs because when those programs are developed, those developers and researchers in some cases are considering the strength that's needed. So how evidence-based is that program? And some programs have research behind them. That dosage consideration, it's deciding here's what needs to be included and here's how many lessons. It's mapping out that scope and sequence so the teachers don't have to do it. Those often include elements of explicit instruction. So the teacher modeling skills, having students do skills together where they get immediate feedback is built into those programs. And then motivation and engagement for students is considered. And so that's a lot for a teacher to be expected to kind of think about, especially if they're doing multiple interventions in their classrooms. So that's why many schools will use intervention programs. But in the end, you can follow your data to help you identify what to do next in those situations, and when you might want to use intervention programs, maybe for specific skill deficits that you're looking at. And as you start to use those, a couple tips when you think about that is to encourage teachers to use those programs as they're written. Many times we want to use it maybe a day or two a week. We want to kind of bring in other things that we've been using over time. Those programs, when they're researched, have a lot of research around them. And so using them as they're designed is really helpful. And having teachers trained in both what that program is, as well as why each component is included, is really important for seeing success from those interventions. Having schedules in place that allow teachers to be able to implement those interventions. So whether that is a specific intervention period within your school, where teachers within a grade are able to share students and teach specific intervention, specific skill deficits at once, or another way, thinking about how the schedule can support teachers to be able to deliver those interventions in a way that's going to accelerate student progress. And then finally, if you do have different programs or even strategies and routines that teachers have access to, creating a library of those and a list and identifying, okay, here are the interventions that are or routines that are specifically tied to phonics skill deficits. Here are the routines that are specifically aligned to phonemic awareness skill deficits. Having that built out for teachers can be really powerful, so that they can know how to, as they're thinking about meeting a specific student's needs, or parents ask them, my student is at risk in reading, what are you doing what is that support going to look like? They can explain to parents, we're using this program that's going to target specifically these the students' phonemic awareness skills or phonics skill needs. That's what we're looking at. So those are all tips as you're thinking about using intervention for students who you find maybe at risk in reading, given your screening, your at-risk rescreening tool. And I'm going to finish today, before we take some questions, with some tricky situations that might show up in your school. So the first is, for those of you, which it was at least about half, I think, of those of you who are here, you might have two screening tools. So you have a screening tool that you're using, and then you also have the tool that you're going to use for your California at-risk screening test. You might see, and we hope that you see, for the vast majority of your learners, or all of them, that they are on track readers in both of those screening tools. That would be fantastic to see, and I can't wait for you to see that for the vast majority of your learners, and hopefully in a year or two for all of them, right? And you might see that students are at risk on both. So when they're at risk on one of these evidence-based tools, they're also at risk on another evidence-based tool. That is commonly what you might see for students who are at risk. But you're going to have some tricky students who didn't know they were supposed to follow what the technical manual says, and they might be on track on one of your screening tools, but at risk on the other. And so what are your teachers to do in that situation? What are we going to do if on one of the screening tools, students on track reader, and another, they're an at-risk reader? Here's what I'm going to suggest you do. The first step is to review the screening subtests. So are there specific subtests where you can get a sense of that, you know, a student is overall on track or overall at risk. And on these specific subtests, I see like subtests maybe that are showing phonemic awareness skills, they're on track, but there are some phonics skills that they're not on track for. So then I would have a sense of what are the skills that a student might be a little bit behind in that we want to provide some additional instruction around and intervention around. Another thing you may do to try to find some convergent information to say, is the student really on track in reading or are they really at risk in reading, is to look at your curriculum mastery check. So within your curricular, if you have curricular tools and curriculum that you use in reading for K2, many times most of those curriculum have regular mastery checks every 5 to 10 lessons where teachers are getting information about how students are mastering skills. And so I can use those regular mastery checks and look back to see, okay, on those checks, does the student tend to be on track on those steps, on each of those checks, or do they tend to fall out sometimes? Because if they do tend to fall off and aren't mastering the skills on each of those regular curriculum checks in my reading curriculum, then I might now have a sense of, you know what, this child might really be an at-risk reader, and I want to make sure that they get something extra in order to catch them up. And finally, you might want to collect diagnostic data for that child. So looking to see, do we have a phonics survey within our building that we use that I can collect additional data to see, is the child on track or are there specific skills that they still need to learn? And all of those data can help you think about if we have a tricky student who's on track on one screening measure, they're at risk on another screening measure, specifically, what are they on track or are they at risk? So I would use those pieces of data to help identify and answer that question and really dig into and think about what we might do next, which is the bigger, better goal, right, of all of this is the purpose of screening is to identify what am I going to do next? And these types of steps can help you identify what to do next in those scenarios where students might have conflicting risk levels on different assessments that you're using. And then I would communicate that with families too. So this isn't from the state. It's not a recommended script to use. But if you are looking at communicating, if your data indicates that there's not risk in reading, but the student maybe showed up as at risk on the California Reading Risk Screener, and so you're communicating that to parents and helping them understand what those data mean, then you might say, you know, your child's classroom work and our other data suggest they don't need additional reading support right now. So we'll continue to monitor their reading growth during classroom instruction and contact you if any concerns arise. So if we have data that suggests they were at risk, but all of their other data show that they're not, including our other very technically valid screening tool, I might say that. If those other measures kind of suggest, you know what, I think they might be at risk, even if our other screening measure says maybe they're not, but my California Risk Screener says they might be, then I'm going to explain. To help your child become a successful reader, we'll provide additional reading support, and this support includes, I'm going to lay out specifically what we're going to do to help support that child. So identifying what are the things we're going to do, not erring on the side of, you know what, on one of our tools, they showed up okay, and so we're just going to say they're okay, but we're really digging in and looking at the other data that you have, knowing that schools have a lot of data and teachers do have that, looking to see, is this child really an at-risk reader, and then digging in to those data to identify what that might be and what they might be next. So that's thinking about that tricky situation. So over the last about 45 minutes, we've talked about interpreting screening results, what they're telling us as opposed to other types of data that we have in schools, and then thinking about using those data that you're going to have next year to inform both your tier 1 instruction and the intervention that you might provide to all students as a result of these data, to help you also for students who have the most significant reading needs, you're able to provide the most intensive interventions for, and using your data to help inform those interventions so that they can really specifically target individual student needs. So I hope that you've gotten at least one idea and nugget that you can take back as you're thinking about implementing this code as you go into the new year and get the opportunity to screen, to intervene, which is the biggest and best bang for the buck but I'm also really happy to take some questions that have arisen.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for that amazing presentation. And we do have quite a few questions that I will kind of start asking you.
Fantastic.
If a student is low in nonsense word fluency, as shown on one of the measures of the screener,
Yeah.
what should a teacher's small group instruction look like to support that particular deficit?
That's a fantastic question. And a really common question, because nonsense word fluency is tricky. So we see it and we're like, wait, am I supposed to be teaching students to read nonsense words? And we are not supposed to teach students to read nonsense words. So that's like the first step. I wouldn't say that that I would teach students to read nonsense words. This is a time where the assessment that we use and the instruction that we give are actually a little bit different. So nonsense word fluency is a really great measure of phonics skills, and specifically can students blend sounds together to form words. The reason that we use nonsense words is because students who've had really great access to literature, their parents have read to them every day, their teachers are regularly reading, and they're seeing lots of books, and they're around lots of literature, they might memorize some words. And so they see the word cat, and they've seen it so many times in books as they're being read, that they see cat and they say cat. But they actually don't know that the word cat is made up of the sounds k, a, and so we use nonsense word fluency as a measure because it gets us around that memorization to really be able to hone in on, does a student have knowledge of those individual letter sounds, and can they blend them together to form words? So that's why that assessment is used. When we're teaching students to read, we want them to read words that are real, and we want them to be thinking about, as I blend these sounds together that I'm learning, they should sound like real words. And so when we're teaching that small group instruction, then so to go back to your question, so when we're teaching small group instruction, it's a phonics skill deficit. And then I would make sure that students are accurate with individual letter sounds that we're teaching, so the focus of our instruction. And then I would also make sure that we have lots of opportunities to blend those sounds into words as soon as possible. So if you're using reading curriculum, or if you have looked at research around reading, you'll often see that the order in which we teach sounds is not the order, it's not ABC order, because we want students to very quickly be able to get into reading lots of words. And so I would make sure that we're teaching individual letter sounds, and then also give students as quickly as possible opportunities to start blending lots of words together as they're learning those sounds. That would be the instruction that I would use. And then I would continue to use that nonsense word fluency measure, the screening, and maybe progress monitoring measure for some of our little kids, because it's a great measure to find out how students are acquiring those skills.
Great. And a similar question came in about what happens when a student scores low in oral reading fluency. What might a small group instruction look like regarding that support?
That's a great question too. So for oral reading fluency, it's a little trickier. So when oral reading fluency actually measures how students are putting together all of these reading skills. And so as we're reading, and if you think about it, and you think about reading different passages, so I like to read fiction books for fun. And as I read those, I'm reading really quickly generally. But I also read a lot of research articles for work. And I'm not reading nearly as quickly when I'm reading those research articles, because they have bigger words and I'm really trying to understand it. It's harder for me to do the language comprehension part of reading as I'm reading those articles. And so my reading fluency automatically drops. So reading fluency is actually measuring all of those skills together. Because it has fluency in the title, we often think of it as just aligned to fluency as that skill. And so we often go straight to, a student is at risk in oral reading fluency, and so we're going to give a fluency intervention. That may be the case for many students, but I encourage you to look at students' accuracy too, and look to see if they're missing a lot of words, or if for older students, like your second grade students, for the end of second grade, or definitely after second grade, if they're reading pretty few words on oral reading fluency, it's pretty slow and labored reading, then you might actually look to phonics deficits. So it might be that that it's a fluency intervention, but you might also want to check into phonics skills, especially if you're giving some intervention, giving students extra practice reading, but you're not seeing good growth. Then you might want to dig into some phonics skills too and see if that's a need. So that's kind of the skill need. Now let's talk about the instructional component. So now let's say I have students who have a specific fluency need. For that, what the research shows is students really need to be practicing reading. And so that might be reading extra decodable books. It might be just a lot of extra reading time. The trick with that is that I'm going to want to have to make sure that students are doing the reading. So not silent reading on their own, but reading with a partner or reading with all together, kind of we're reading a book, we're reading together as a class and doing choral reading or some closed reading. And so really giving students a lot of opportunities to read in connected text is what builds reading fluency. And as students are starting out, using decodable text makes sense so that they're only practicing and having to practice the skills that they've learned so far. Once they have strong decoding skills, then this wide reading and a lot of reading is important. But structured by the teacher would be what I would be focusing on.
That's great, Dr. Brown. And I would add too that we've seen
Please.
so much success with repeated reading. And I know a lot of school districts here use Read Naturally, but they can also use the research-based approach of repeated reading with readworks.org, which is a free website for teachers. So there's lots of options, and repeated reading is a great one to look into as well.
Repeated reading is fantastic. We just want to make sure that yes, and making sure that students aren't just reading it like once a day for 5 days, but they're getting repeated readings of that. That's one thing that I see sometimes that, yeah, can be a little bit more intensified in classrooms.
Perfect.
Great addition, Jessica.
Another question we have is if you could speak to how one might decide on a whole class intervention versus small group intervention versus one-on-one intervention, and in class tier 1, or if that student may need pullout as well. So how do you make those decisions when you look at your list of students who have been screened?
That's a great question. So here's what it comes down to in many schools. It comes down to resources. So if you have enough resources to intervene and provide good intervention that's going to accelerate learning for all students who are at-risk readers, then great. Skip tier 1 in class-wide intervention altogether and go straight and provide that small group individual intervention for students who need it. If you see that you have more students who need intervention than you have resources to provide, then here are really the two things I would be thinking about. One, I would make sure that the students with the highest risk in reading are getting the most intensive interventions. The most intensive individualized interventions go to the students with the highest risk. That's the first thing I would be thinking about. The second thing I would be thinking about is when you're doing a class-wide intervention, what specific skills are we targeting? And so if we're targeting maybe fluency skills for that, then I would start with students who I would provide that extra tier 2, tier 3, more intensive individualized intervention to students who struggle with maybe phonemic awareness and phonics skills, because our classified intervention is targeting a different skill. So I would be thinking about those two pieces. Students with the most intensive needs get the most intensive interventions, and then also where is your class-wide intervention targeting, and then providing that extra supplemental interventions through small groups or one-to-one for students who have different specific skill gaps. I don't know, Jessica or Tammy, if you have anything else to add to that.
I think that's great.
Okay.
There was another interesting question that came through that I'd like to ask as well. So what if a student is at grade level in reading, but when they go to do phoneme segmentation, they are below level? So in other words, they can read fluently, but surprisingly, the measures are showing that they're behind.
Yeah. So if it's specifically your phonemic awareness measures, I wouldn't ignore that K2, because phonemic awareness has a big impact on spelling and encoding skills, as well as when we start to read multisyllabic words. And so I wouldn't ignore the phonemic awareness subtests or the phonemic awareness parts of your screening measures. So I would be providing phonemic awareness intervention. The great news about that is we can, for most students, we can like crush it with phonemic awareness skills pretty quickly. And so just a little bit of extra intervention, a little bit of extra, really, it's just practice, a little bit of extra practice with phonemic awareness skills every day, maybe a couple times a day for just a couple minutes. Usually for most students, closes that gap with phonemic awareness, and it's going to be really helpful to them as they get into higher grades. K2, I absolutely would not ignore phonemic awareness.
Great. We probably have time for about one more question. We received a question that asked, how will a district determine if intervention is evidence-based and matches student need? For example, there are many educators who may want to continue to use either materials or an intervention based on the 3 cueing system, such as FMP or LLI, with students who demonstrate a need in phonics and phonemic awareness. So how do you recommend finding interventions that are evidence-based and aligned with the intention of the ed code in terms of a evidence-based intervention?
So there are some sites that have reviewed interventions in particular. So the National Center on Intensive Intervention is one of those. So that's one place that schools can go to look. You can also use the criteria that I showed on that one slide and compare your interventions to those criteria. Do your interventions have those pieces, whether they're routines that teachers are using or specific materials? You can compare them to that to see. You can also look to see, what is the percentage of time that this intervention is targeted toward the specific skill gaps that our assessments are telling us that a student needs. And finally, let your data do the talking. So if you are in a place where you're like, you know what, my teachers are really gunning for this intervention and it's what they have buy-in for, and they're the ones who are doing it. I don't know if I can change to something else right now with everything else that's happening. Don't change, but put in place frequent progress monitoring for students, and then come back together as a team every 4 to 6 weeks-ish and have a conversation about how student data are looking and how student progress is going, and then be willing to intensify or change that intervention to meet students' needs. Because at the end of the day, this is about our students becoming successful readers early on in that early intervention component. So we need to let our student data tell us what we need to do next.
Great. So Dr. Brown, if you would just move the to the next slide. Perfect. We have our survey on here. And if you all would kindly fill out the survey as by way of registration for this event as well, that would be helpful. And we really appreciate your time, Dr. Brown. This was an amazing presentation and gave us a lot of the actual to-dos that we need to consider as we're moving forward in this screening work. We thank you all for being here with us and encourage you to come to our next event, which is on April 24th, and that will be questions from the field. We thank you all and wish you a very nice evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Brown. Yeah, thank you so much. It's wonderful. Goodbye, everyone. Take care.